Dorothy Williams stood at her kitchen window one sunny morning in Atlanta, watching the neighborhood children walk to school. At 72 years old, she still kept the same routine she had maintained during her 40 years as a school teacher. Wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of coffee with just a touch of cream, and watch the world come alive outside her modest brick home on Maple Street. Her weathered hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug as she thought about how much the world had changed. The same streets where she used to see children playing hopscotch now showed kids with their heads down, staring at phones. But Dorothy had changed with the times too. After Gerald, her husband of 45 years, passed away 3 years ago, she had learned to navigate the internet, use online banking, and even join social media to keep in touch with her former students. Better check those accounts, she muttered to herself, following her daily routine. Dorothy was proud of how she and Gerald had saved every penny they could. While other teachers spent their summers traveling, she had taken summer school classes. While friends bought new cars, she and Gerald kept their old Buick running for 20 years. All that sacrifice had added up to a comfortable nest egg of $450,000. Not enough to live like a queen, but enough to ensure she would never be a burden to her children. Walking to her small home office, Dorothy sat down at the desk Gerald had built her when she first started teaching. The smooth oak surface still held pictures of her favorite classes, including the 1985 group that had given her a World's Best Teacher mug she still used. She opened her laptop, a gift from her grandson Marcus Jr., who insisted she needed something reliable for her online banking. As she typed in her banking website address, a small pop-up appeared. Security alert. Your account requires immediate verification. Dorothy adjusted her reading glasses, frowning slightly. She had always been careful with her money, just like her mama had taught her. A penny saved is a penny earned. She could still hear her mother's voice saying. The pop-up looked official, with her bank's logo and familiar blue colors. Still, something made her hesitate. She remembered what Marcus Jr. had told her about computer safety during his last visit. Grandma, if anything ever looks strange, call the bank directly. Don't click on anything you're not sure about. But before she could reach for her phone, it rang. The caller ID showed her bank's name. Hello, Mrs. Williams, a professional-sounding woman said. This is Sarah from Central Bank Security. We detected some unusual activity on your account. Have you tried logging in this morning? Dorothy's heart began to beat faster. Yes, I was just about to check my balance. That's what triggered our security alert, Sarah explained patiently. We've been seeing attempts to access your account from overseas. We need to verify your identity to protect your savings. Something about Sarah's voice was reassuring. She sounded young, professional, and genuinely concerned. She knew Dorothy's name, her bank, and even mentioned the recent deposit from her pension, something only the bank would know. We just need to confirm a few details, Sarah continued. We'll send you a secure verification code, and then we can make sure your accounts are protected. Dorothy looked at the framed photo of Gerald on her desk. He had always handled their banking in person, preferring to walk into the branch and speak with real people. But times had changed, and Dorothy was determined to keep up. After all, she had taught herself to use email, Facebook, and even that Zoom thing during the pandemic. She could handle this too. All right, Dorothy said, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What do I need to do first? As she followed Sarah's instructions, Dorothy had no way of knowing that this conversation would be the beginning of a nightmare, one that would test her strength, challenge her faith in humanity, and ultimately reveal a steel core of determination that even she didn't know she possessed. The scammers had chosen their target carefully, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson. Never underestimate a retired teacher who had spent 40 years keeping order in a classroom full of teenagers. The morning sun had faded into afternoon shadows as Dorothy Williams continued her phone call with Sarah from Bank Security. Her coffee sat cold and forgotten on the desk beside her, a small ring forming underneath the cup on her papers. Now, Mrs. Williams, I can see someone tried to withdraw $5,000 from your account in Singapore just an hour ago, Sarah said, her voice filled with practiced concern. Thankfully, our security system caught it in time. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the phone tighter. Singapore? But I'd never even been there. Exactly why we flagged it, Sarah replied smoothly. Now, we need to move your money to a secure protection account right away. This is a special service we provide to our most valued customers. In a small office building across town, Sarah Reeves smiled as she read from her carefully prepared script. Next to her, Marcus Chen nodded approvingly while monitoring Dorothy's computer activity through their remote access software. They had spent months perfecting their scheme, targeting elderly account holders with substantial savings. Dorothy Williams was their biggest mark yet. "Mrs. Williams, I'm going to connect you with our head of security, Mr. Chen," Sarah said, passing the headset to Marcus. "They'll help protect your savings." Marcus took the call, his voice deep and authoritative. "Mrs. Williams, this is Marcus Chen, Senior Security Manager. I understand criminals are trying to steal your life savings. We need to act fast." Dorothy sat straighter in her chair. Mr. Chen sounded just like the bank managers she'd known over the years. Professional, confident, and reassuring. She watched as he guided her through a series of steps on her computer screen, explaining how they would secure her money. "See that green shield icon?" Marcus asked. "That means you're on our secure platform. Now, we'll start moving your funds to the protected account." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus and Sarah worked together, gradually convincing Dorothy to transfer her money in small amounts. They showed her fake screens of attempted criminal attacks being blocked, praising her quick action in working with them to save her money. "Look at that, Mrs. Williams," Marcus exclaimed. "We just stopped another attempt from Russia. Good thing we're moving your funds to safety." Dorothy watched the numbers on her screen change as she followed their instructions. First $50,000, then another $75,000, each transfer accompanied by official-looking confirmation screens designed by the scammers. "You're doing great," Sarah chimed in occasionally. "Your money is almost secure." In their office, Marcus and Sarah exchanged knowing smiles as they watched the money flow into their network of offshore accounts. Their setup was impressive. Multiple computer screens showed fake banking interfaces, security alerts, and customer profiles. They had spent years perfecting their operation, learning to sound professional and trustworthy. "Just a few more steps," Marcus assured Dorothy. "We're almost done securing your life savings." Dorothy glanced at the clock. She had been on the phone for nearly 4 hours now. Outside her window, the mail carrier was making his afternoon rounds. Everything seemed so normal, yet she was in the middle of what she thought was an emergency operation to save her money. "And there we go," Marcus finally announced. "All your funds are now in the secure protection account. In 24 to 48 hours, once we've confirmed all criminal activity has stopped, you'll have full access again." Dorothy let out a relieved sigh. "Thank you both so much. I don't know what I would have done without your help." After the call ended, Marcus and Sarah celebrated in their office. Another perfect score. Marcus grinned, watching the confirmation of transfers roll in. She didn't suspect a thing. What they didn't know was that their perfect score was about to become their biggest mistake. They had just stolen from someone who had spent 4 decades handling unruly teenagers, managing school budgets, and developing the patience and persistence that would soon turn their lives upside down. As Dorothy prepared for bed that night, feeling grateful that her money was safe, she had no idea that tomorrow would bring a discovery that would awaken something fierce inside her, a determination to not just recover her losses, but to make sure these scammers regretted ever learning her name. The next morning started like any other for Dorothy Williams. She made her coffee, checked her morning pills, and sat down to balance her checkbook, an old habit she kept even in the digital age. But when she logged into her real bank account, her heart stopped. $726.42. That's all that was left. Dorothy blinked hard, adjusted her glasses, and looked again. Where there should have been $450,000, she now saw less money than she spent on groceries each month. Her hands began to shake so badly that she knocked over her coffee cup, sending brown liquid spreading across her desk calendar. "No, no, no," she whispered, quickly dialing the bank's real phone number, the one printed on the back of her debit card, not the one from yesterday's call. "This has to be a mistake." The young bank representative, Michael, spoke slowly after verifying her identity. "Mrs. Williams, I'm showing several large transfers were made from your account yesterday. They were authorized using your online banking credentials. But that was to protect my money." Dorothy's voice cracked. "The security team called me. Sarah and Mr. Chen from the bank's security department." A long pause followed. "Ma'am," Michael said gently, We don't have any Sarah or Mr. Chen working in our security department. And we would never call to ask you to transfer money to a protection account. The room started spinning. Dorothy gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't been talking to the bank at all. The pop-up, the call, the transfers, it had all been a lie. I need to speak to the police, she said, her voice shaking. 2 hours later, Officer Jenkins sat in Dorothy's living room, taking notes. He was young, probably the same age as some of her former students. His face showed sympathy, but his words offered little hope. These scammers are usually operating from overseas, he explained. They use fake numbers, fake names. The money gets moved through multiple accounts within hours. It's very difficult to trace. Dorothy sat in her husband Gerald's old armchair, clutching a tissue. On the wall behind her hung photographs spanning decades. Her wedding day, her first class of students, her children's graduations, her grandchildren's births. Every picture represented years of careful saving, of choosing generic brands over name brands, of driving old cars and taking cheap vacations. So that's it? She asked quietly. They just get away with it? Officer Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. We'll file a report, but honestly, Mrs. Williams, in cases like this, the money is usually gone for good. I'm sorry. After the police left, Dorothy sat alone in her quiet house, the same house where she and Gerald had raised their children, the same house she had planned to leave to them one day, along with a nice inheritance. Now all those plans were dust. She walked to her bedroom and opened her jewelry box. Inside was her grandmother's old Bible, worn and well-loved. As she lifted it out, a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. It was a note her grandmother had written her years ago, when Dorothy was struggling with a particularly difficult class of students. Remember, baby, the note read in her grandmother's shaky handwriting, when the devil throws his worst at you, that's when the Lord expects your best. Sometimes you got to be your own angel of justice. Dorothy read those words 3 times, something shifting inside her. The tears dried on her cheeks, her hands stopped shaking. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a victim anymore. She saw 40 years of handling troublemakers in her classroom, 40 years of outsmarting teenagers who thought they could fool their teacher. She walked back to her office and picked up the phone. Marcus Jr.? She said when her grandson answered. I need your help with something. Remember how you always said I should learn more about computers? Well, I'm ready for those lessons now. As she hung up the phone, Dorothy Williams wasn't just an elderly woman who had lost her savings. She was a retired teacher with 4 decades of experience in dealing with people who thought they could outsmart her. And she was about to give these scammers an education they would never forget. Marcus Jr. arrived at his grandmother's house carrying a laptop bag and a determined expression. At 26, he worked as an IT specialist for a major tech company, and the thought of scammers targeting his grandmother made his blood boil. First thing, Grandma, he said, setting up his equipment on her dining room table, I need you to tell me everything you remember about yesterday. Every single detail matters. Dorothy sat across from him, a notebook ready. The same notebook she had used to record troublemakers in her classroom for 40 years. I saved all the numbers they called from, she said, pushing a paper toward him. And I wrote down every website they made me visit. Marcus Jr.'s eyes widened as he looked at his grandmother's neat handwriting. Even in the middle of being scammed, she had kept her teacher's habit of documenting everything. This wasn't the confused victim the scammers thought they had found. Smart move, Grandma, he said, typing the numbers into his laptop. Really smart. While Marcus worked his tech magic, Dorothy made another call. Barbara? I need your help, she said to her best friend of 30 years, who worked as a paralegal at Johnson & Myers law firm. An hour later, Barbara Jenkins walked through the door, carrying a stack of legal files. I pulled every fraud case we've handled in the last 5 years, she announced, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. These scammers usually follow patterns. The dining room turned into an investigation headquarters. Marcus Jr. traced IP addresses and phone numbers while Barbara spread out case files across the table. Dorothy sat between them, connecting dots that neither of them caught. Look here, Dorothy said, pointing to her notes. The scammer named Sarah mentioned my recent pension deposit. Only someone with local banking connections would know about that timing. Barbara nodded, pulling out a file. We had another case last month, The scammers knew details about local bank deposits too. They'd have to have someone feeding them information. Marcus Jr. suddenly sat up straighter, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Grandma, that fake banking site they made you visit, it's not hosted overseas. The server is right here in Atlanta. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. She walked to her old teaching map of Atlanta, still hanging on the wall. Show me where exactly. Marcus Jr. gave her an address, and Dorothy marked it with a red pin. Then Barbara started reading addresses from her fraud cases, and Dorothy added more pins. A pattern emerged. All these scam reports, Dorothy said slowly, they're all happening within 5 miles of this office building on Peachtree Street. Barbara pulled out her phone and showed them a business directory. Look at this. That building houses several financial consulting companies that opened in the last year. And their website was registered by the same person who set up that fake banking site. Marcus Jr. added, still typing, someone named Marcus Chen. Dorothy sat down heavily in her chair. That was the name he used, the man who called himself the security manager. The three of them looked at each other as the pieces fell into place. These weren't overseas scammers impossible to catch. They were right here in Atlanta, probably scamming other elderly people right now. We need to go to the police, Barbara said, reaching for her phone. Wait, Dorothy held up her hand, the same gesture she had used to quiet rowdy classrooms. The police already said they can't help without proof. We need more evidence. She walked to her bedroom and came back with an old jewelry box. Inside was an expensive-looking diamond necklace, actually costume jewelry Gerald had bought her at the state fair 30 years ago. Marcus Jr., can you make me a very impressive-looking fake bank statement? She asked, holding up the necklace. One showing that I just inherited $2 million from a relative. Her grandson's eyes widened as he realized what she was planning. Grandma, that's dangerous. Dorothy smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm grandmother smile. It was the smile her students used to see when they thought they had fooled her, just before she proved them wrong. All my life I taught children about consequences, she said, hanging the fake diamond necklace around her neck. It's time to give these scammers their final exam. Dorothy Williams stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying red lipstick, something she hadn't worn since Gerald's funeral. Her silver hair was freshly done at the salon, and her fake diamond necklace sparkled under the lights. The transformation from retired teacher to wealthy widow was nearly complete. You sure about this, Grandma? Marcus Jr. asked from the doorway. He had spent the past week creating a perfect fake inheritance document showing Dorothy had received $2.1 million from a distant aunt in California. When Tommy Baker thought he could cheat on his final exam in 1992, Dorothy said, adjusting her pearls, I didn't just catch him, I let him think he got away with it first. That's how you teach a real lesson. In her living room, Barbara was going through the plan one more time. They had spent days setting everything up, leaving nothing to chance. Mrs. Peterson from your church group has already spread the word about your inheritance, Barbara said, checking her list. And my cousin at the local news station will run a small piece about local retired teacher receives surprise inheritance tomorrow morning. Dorothy nodded. The bait was being set carefully. Marcus Chen and his gang of scammers would soon hear about the wealthy elderly woman who had just come into money. But first, they needed to establish her story. Time for Phase 1, Dorothy announced. That afternoon, Dorothy visited 3 different luxury car dealerships. At each one, she looked at their most expensive cars, flashed her fake bank statement, and talked loudly about her recent inheritance. She made sure to mention how she was still deciding which bank to trust with all this money. My late aunt didn't trust banks, she told every salesperson who would listen. Kept all her money in gold and cash. Now I need somewhere safe to put it all. By the end of the day, the story was spreading through Atlanta's financial circles exactly as planned. A wealthy widow with millions in cash, looking for financial advice. Exactly the kind of target Marcus Chen and his team couldn't resist. Back at home, Marcus Jr. set up sophisticated recording equipment throughout Dorothy's house. Everything's ready, he said, showing her how the tiny cameras worked. The FBI agent Barbara knows said this will give them everything they need. Dorothy sat in Gerald's old armchair, looking at the photo of her empty bank account. Now we wait, she said quietly. They'll come to us. She didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Right after the local news story aired, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number, one she had written down during the original scam. "Mrs. Williams," a smooth male voice said. "This is Thomas Chen from Elite Financial Services. I couldn't help but hear about your recent good fortune. We specialize in helping clients like yourself manage unexpected wealth." Dorothy caught Barbara's eye across the room and smiled. Different name, same voice. Marcus Chen was taking the bait. "Oh my," Dorothy said, making her voice shake slightly. "I've been so worried about finding someone trustworthy to help me with all this money. My aunt always said not to trust banks." "We completely understand," Chen said smoothly. "We offer very exclusive private banking services. Perhaps we could meet to discuss your options." After arranging a meeting for the following day, Dorothy hung up and looked at her team. "Did you get all that?" Marcus Jr. nodded, holding up his laptop where he traced the call. "Got his real number this time, and the FBI team is ready for tomorrow." Dorothy walked to her old classroom map where they had marked the scammer's office. Soon, she would be walking into their trap, except it wasn't their trap anymore. It was hers. "Barbara," she said, "call your friend at the FBI again. Tell him to have his team ready. Tomorrow, we're giving these scammers a lesson in consequences they'll never forget." As the sun set over Atlanta, Dorothy Williams wasn't just planning revenge. She was preparing to teach her most important lesson, one that would show Marcus Chen and his gang that they had made a terrible mistake when they decided to steal from a teacher who had spent 40 years outsmarting people who thought they could fool her. The final exam was about to begin, and Dorothy intended to make it one her students would never forget. At exactly 10 a.m., Dorothy Williams walked into the gleaming office building on Peachtree Street. She wore her best church dress, the fake diamond necklace, and carried a large handbag that contained much more than just her wallet. Hidden inside was $50,000 in cash that the FBI had provided as evidence money, along with a sophisticated recording device. "Mrs. Williams," Marcus Chen greeted her in the lobby, now dressed in an expensive suit instead of working from behind a phone. "Welcome to Elite Financial Services." He was younger than she had imagined, probably in his mid-30s, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Dorothy played her role perfectly, acting like a slightly confused elderly woman overwhelmed by her new wealth. "Oh my, such a lovely office," she said, clutching her handbag closer. "My aunt always said to be careful with money matters." Sarah Reeves was waiting in the conference room, wearing a professional skirt suit, a far cry from the voice on the phone that had helped steal Dorothy's savings. Neither of them showed any sign of recognizing her voice from their previous scam. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Williams?" Sarah asked sweetly, playing the part of the caring financial advisor. "That would be lovely, dear," Dorothy replied, while secretly pressing the recording device in her bag. In a van parked across the street, Marcus Jr. and 3 FBI agents monitored everything through audio and video feeds. "So, Mrs. Williams," Marcus Chen began, spreading papers across the table, "tell us more about this inheritance. We want to ensure your aunt's hard-earned money is properly protected." Dorothy opened her handbag, making sure they caught a glimpse of the cash inside. "Well, my aunt never trusted banks after the Great Depression. She kept everything in cash and gold." She leaned forward and whispered, "I have over $2 million sitting in my house right now. I'm just so worried about keeping it safe." She watched their eyes light up with greed. It was the same look she'd seen in students' eyes when they thought they had successfully cheated on a test. "We have a special secure investment program for cases like yours," Marcus said smoothly. "Very exclusive, very private. No regular banks involved." For the next hour, they walked her through their investment program, the same type of scam they had used to steal her savings, but now modified for a bigger target. Dorothy played along, asking innocent questions and acting increasingly convinced. "I do have some cash with me today," she said carefully, patting her handbag. "Perhaps I could start with a small investment, just to see how it works." Marcus and Sarah had exchanged quick glances. "Of course," Sarah said warmly. "We can process that right now through our secure system." As Sarah pulled up their fake banking website, the same one they had used to steal Dorothy's savings, Marcus Jr.'s voice came through the tiny earpiece Dorothy was wearing. "FBI team is in position, Grandma. Just give the signal." Dorothy slowly pulled out the stack of cash from her bag. Before we start, she said, her voice changing from confused elderly woman to stern teacher, perhaps you could explain what happened to the $450,000 you stole from me last week. The color drained from both their faces. Marcus started to stand up, but Dorothy continued, her teacher voice now in full force. Sit down, Mr. Chen. Class isn't dismissed yet. The conference room door burst open as FBI agents rushed in. Marcus tried to run but was quickly tackled. Sarah reached for her phone, only to find herself in handcuffs. Dorothy Williams, she gasped, finally recognizing her voice. That's Mrs. Williams to you, Dorothy corrected, standing up straight, and you just failed my final exam. As the FBI agents led the scammers away, they found 5 more members of their operation in the building. Computers were seized, records were confiscated, and dozens of other victims were identified. Dorothy watched from the lobby as Marcus Chen and Sarah Reeves were placed in police cars. One of the FBI agents approached her with a smile. Mrs. Williams, I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of working fraud cases. You just helped us break up one of the biggest elder scam operations in Atlanta. Dorothy smiled, touching the fake diamond necklace at her throat. Well, Agent Thompson, sometimes the best way to catch someone cheating is to let them think they're the smartest person in the room. She walked out of the building into the bright Atlanta sunshine, knowing that her 40 years of teaching experience had just taught her most important lesson yet. The days following the arrest turned Dorothy Williams' quiet life upside down. FBI agents filled her living room, spreading out files and laptops across her floral pattern couch. Her dining room table, which usually hosted Sunday family dinners, now held evidence boxes and computer records. Mrs. Williams, Agent Thompson said, showing her a thick folder, your detailed notes about their scam helped us connect them to over 50 other victims. Most of them were elderly people like yourself. Dorothy sat in Gerald's armchair, looking at the photographs of other victims. There was a retired doctor who lost his entire pension, a widow who lost her husband's life insurance money, and dozens of other seniors who had their savings stolen. The total amount they stole, Agent Thompson continued, is close to $5 million. And thanks to your sting operation, we've frozen all their accounts. Marcus Jr., who had taken a week off work to help with the investigation, looked up from his laptop with a grin. Grandma, you won't believe this. They kept records of everything. Every scam, every phone call, every fake website. They were so confident they'd never get caught. Barbara arrived with more news from her law firm. The DA is pressing charges on multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. They're looking at serious prison time. Dorothy picked up one of the victims' photos, an elderly man who looked about her age. What about their money? Can everyone get it back? Agent Thompson nodded. Because you helped us catch them so quickly, we were able to freeze their assets before they could move most of the money offshore. The legal process will take time, but we should be able to return a significant portion to all victims. As if on cue, Dorothy's phone rang. It was her bank. Mrs. Williams, the bank manager said, his voice excited. I'm calling to inform you that $437,892 has been returned to your account. The FBI provided documentation for an emergency funds return. Dorothy's hands shook as she wrote down the number. Almost all of her money was back. She thought of Gerald, how proud he would be that she hadn't given up. Later that afternoon, local news vans parked outside her house. The story had gotten out, how a retired school teacher had outsmarted a gang of sophisticated scammers. Dorothy watched from her window as reporters set up their cameras. You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to, Barbara said protectively. But Dorothy was already fixing her hair. Actually, I think I should. Other seniors need to know how to protect themselves. On her front porch, Dorothy gave interviews to 3 different news channels. She explained how the scammers operated, the warning signs she had missed, and how others could protect themselves. The most important thing, she told the reporters, is to remember that real banks never ask you to transfer money to protect it, and never trust caller ID. Scammers can fake that too. By evening, her story was running on every local channel. Her phone kept ringing with calls from other seniors thanking her for speaking out. Even some of her former students called after seeing her on TV. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit has offered you a part-time job, Marcus Jr. announced, reading an email. They want you to help teach seniors about online security. Dorothy smiled, remembering all the times she had taught her students about making good choices. Now she could keep teaching, but in a whole new way. Agent Thompson returned one last time that evening with more news. "We found something interesting in their records," he said. "They had a rating system for potential victims. Do you know what they wrote next to your name after they scammed you?" Dorothy shook her head. "Easy target, retired teacher, lives alone. They thought being a teacher made you vulnerable." He smiled. "Turns out being a teacher made you the worst target they could have chosen." As the sun set on an exhausting day, Dorothy sat in her quiet house, looking at her restored bank balance on her computer screen. The scammers had thought she was just another elderly victim, easy to manipulate and quick to forget. Instead, they had learned a powerful lesson. Never underestimate a teacher who spent 40 years dealing with people who thought they could outsmart her. Now they would have plenty of time in prison to think about the education they had received from Mrs. Dorothy Williams. 6 months after the sting operation, Dorothy Williams stood at the front of a packed community center. The room was filled with senior citizens, all eager to learn from the retired teacher who had become Atlanta's unlikely hero in the fight against scammers. "Remember," Dorothy said, pointing to the large screen behind her, "if someone calls claiming to be from your bank, hang up and call the number on the back of your card." She smiled at her audience. "I learned the lesson the hard way, but you don't have to." In the back of the room, Agent Thompson watched with approval. The FBI's Senior Protection Program, with Dorothy as its star speaker, had already helped prevent dozens of potential scams. They now called it the Williams Method, teaching seniors to recognize and outsmart scammers. After the presentation, a small woman about Dorothy's age approached her with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I almost fell for the same scam last week, but I remembered seeing you on TV, and I hung up on them." Dorothy hugged the woman tightly. "Then you just saved yourself a whole lot of heartache, sister." Back at home that evening, Dorothy's family gathered for a celebration. Marcus Jr. had gotten a promotion at his company, partly due to his role in catching the scammers. Barbara brought news about the court case. Marcus Chen and Sarah Reeves got 20 years each, Barbara announced, passing around slices of celebration cake. "The judge used them as an example, said elder fraud needs to stop." Dorothy's daughter Lisa raised her glass. "To Mom, who taught those scammers their final lesson." As everyone laughed and cheered, Dorothy looked around her living room, the same room where 6 months ago she had sat crying over her stolen savings. Now it was filled with joy, family, and the satisfaction of justice served. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Agent Thompson. "Just got word. Last victim's money returned today. 100% recovery complete. You did it, Mrs. Williams." Dorothy smiled, remembering all the other victims she had met during the court proceedings. Many had become her friends, forming a support group that met weekly at her house. They called themselves the Scam Survivors Club. Later that night, after everyone had left, Dorothy sat in Gerald's old armchair and opened her jewelry box. She took out her grandmother's old note, the one about being your own angel of justice. Next to it now sat a new medal, a civilian service award from the FBI. Her laptop dinged with a new email. Another senior center wanted her to speak next week. Below that was an invitation to appear on a national morning show to share her story. Dorothy Williams, once just a retired teacher, had found a new purpose. She walked to her bedroom and looked in the mirror, touching the real diamond necklace at her throat. A gift from the grateful families of other victims who had gotten their money back. The scared woman who had lost her savings was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and ready to help others. The next morning, as she prepared for another presentation, Dorothy checked her restored bank account out of habit. But now, instead of feeling fear, she felt pride. Not just because she had gotten her money back, but because she had turned her nightmare into a way to help others. Going to another senior center, her neighbor called as Dorothy loaded her presentation materials into her car. "Someone's got to teach these scammers a lesson," Dorothy replied with a smile. "Might as well be a teacher." As she drove through Atlanta's morning traffic, Dorothy thought about all the changes the past 6 months had brought. She wasn't just the retired teacher from Maple Street anymore. She was a protector, a teacher still, but now her classroom was bigger than ever. Her phone rang through the car's speaker. Another senior had caught a scammer trying to steal their savings. Another victory. Another lesson taught. Dorothy Williams smiled as she parked at the senior center. For 40 years, she had taught children how to face the world. Now, in her retirement, she was teaching adults how to protect themselves from it. The scammers had tried to take her money, but instead, they had given her something priceless, a new chapter in her life, proving that a teacher never really stops teaching and that sometimes the most important lessons come from our hardest tests. The end.